Cambridge Science Festival event. This is also part of the Cambridge Climate Lecture Series. Every February, March, we run a series of 4 or 5 talks on something related to climate change. This is our 4th season. It all began 4 seasons ago, shortly after the death of David Mackay, who was one of Cambridge's great physicists, scientists, engineers, thinkers on sustainable energy. If you haven't seen his book, Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air, then, well, you can go and buy a copy, but you can find it online. If you type Sustainable Energy Without Hot Air, you'll get there. It's a fabulous view of the possibilities for sustainable energy. Really, it's about numeracy, it's about thinking through things very clearly. So it's great to be remembering David tonight. I'm going to, this event is being live streamed, which means that there will be people listening to us, watching this out there in the ether. And we're going to have plenty of time for questions. And if anybody out there would like to ask questions, then either on Twitter, use the hashtag CCLS2020, or if you're watching on the YouTube channel, then you can comment there, or on Facebook, I think you can comment there as well. For those here in the audience, please don't, when the microphone comes around, please wait for the microphone. That means that people on the live stream will be able to hear your question. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our host, Oliver Morton. And Oliver Morton works for The Economist magazine, briefing editor there. He joined as the energy and environment editor. He was also chief news and features editor of the journal Nature. And he specializes in energy business, climate science and policy. And most interestingly to me is recently he was an author of a book called The Planet Remade, How Geoengineering Could Change the World, which he wrote in 2015. And this is exploring proposals for human intervention in the climate. So we're going to be hearing a lot about climate and biodiversity. So I'd like you to welcome now Oliver to the stage.
Thank you very much, Hugh. It's a great pleasure to be here. Normally we're down the road, but we appear to be here now, obviously. Wow, that was really disjointed. Okay. In previous years, we have been at a different hall. We are now in this hall. It's very nice to be here. It's very nice to see you all. Thank you all for coming out. Please observe any restrictions on touching that anyone you come across may try to enforce on you, so don't force your hand or any other part of you onto anyone else. Apart from that, and do please not cough. We're here to talk about climate and biodiversity. We have an excellent panel. We've been doing this, as Hugh said, for a while now, that at the end of the lecture series we get together for a panel, sometimes of people who've spoken in the series, sometimes not. We have a panel unfortunately depleted by one tonight, in that Bryony Worthington is unfortunately not able to be with us in the flesh. And yet she is with us on this screen here, which you can't see, and I will be able to read out her questions to her panel mates when we get to that stage of the evening. But first, I'd like to introduce our panel, our panel in presence. Emily Shuckburgh, Martin Rees and Partha Dasgupta, all of whom will give a short talk, really only about 5 minutes, really only about 5 minutes. And then we'll have a little talk among the panel, and then I hope to spend at least half of the allotted time in listening to your questions and getting them answered. So with no further ado, here our first speaker is Partha Dasgupta, who is an emeritus professor of economics here in Cambridge and a fellow of St John's and a fellow of the Royal Society. and has worked for a long time in the economics of poverty and nutrition, among other issues, and environmental economics. His new book, which I think you may be mentioning, is called Time and the Generations, Population Ethics for a Diminishing Planet. And particularly important for the biodiversity part of this evening, in March 2019, he was announced as the chair of a global review of biodiversity and its economic value by the Treasury. As some of you will be aware, this is both a big year, was originally planned to be a big year, both for biodiversity and for climate, with some very large meetings at the end of the year. We have yet to see whether those will necessarily go ahead, but the idea that the two subjects have a lot in common is one that you'll be hearing a lot about over the rest of the year, and no better introduction to that shared interest than Partha. Partha.
Thank you very much. Can I have the slide? Thanks.
Keep talking. You've got your line.
Right, yeah. Well, thank you very much. I'll have to be brief. Chair will otherwise assassinate me. But the first thing to note is that biodiversity is not an asset. It's a characteristic of an asset. It's a characteristic of ecosystems. Very much like financial portfolios, there are virtues of having a diverse set of functioning species in tandem. Another way of putting it, biodiversity is a bit like, has the same flavor as trust in a society. On the whole, biodiversity aids in the productivity of ecosystems. And productivity here, I mean the extent to which it can produce living biomass. Now, these are very straightforward remarks, but they're rather deep. A huge amount of scientific work has gone to establish them to the extent that we understand the nature of the functioning of ecosystems. It is generally thought that biodiversity aids productivity, but one has to be very careful. There are several, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment of 2005 classified the kinds of goods and services that Mother Nature offers us. And it is interesting that one category has in some sense dominated the human enterprise, which is provisioning services, which yields food, timber, water, fibers. For that, you don't get much biodiversity. If you go to the Midwest of the United States, you don't see much biodiversity there. But that's at the expense of the regulating and maintenance services that Mother Nature provides, which are invisible. They're usually noticed when they're absent. We take them for granted. And this tension between these two classes of services that Mother Nature offers us has in some sense could be used to describe the history of economic development, certainly since the Industrial Revolution. The big change began about 1950. It's not accidental that Earth scientists now regard the mid-20th century as having ushered in the Anthropocene. I won't go into it, but there's a rich literature explaining why the hockey stick curve time series that you observe in climate sciences is paralleled by a huge number of biochemical signatures. 8, 9 of them have to do with nitrogen, phosphorus, and so forth. So although we've been living at the best of times, all of us have been very lucky to be here now, as opposed to 500 years ago. But it's also amongst the worst of times, because we are eating into nature, because we have neglected the latter category of services. Now, I want to refer to the economics of biodiversity, and I want to contrast it with the economics of climate change, which the latter has had a great deal of attention in the last few years. In its deep sense, it has misled us. It has misled us because there is a sense in which we are encouraged to view the human enterprise as dipping into nature, taking things out transforming them, consuming them, and then throwing them back. There's a detachment between us and nature in the economics of climate change. When you think about biodiversity as a source of your interest in the human enterprise, it becomes absolutely clear that we instead should view ourselves as being embedded in nature. Now that sounds somewhat metaphysical, and you might be surprised that a mathematical economist would engage in that kind of sentence, the distinction between embeddedness and being external, but it can be mathematically shown. It has some strong meaning. So let me use this just to very briefly go through this. We want to look at the impact we have on the biosphere. Let's just say we produce and consume and throw stuff back in there. What's the overall impact? By which I mean, what services are we actually making use of? The easiest way of trying to measure our impact would be through a measurable object like GDP, for example. Okay, I'll use that as a prototype. That's a product of, I'm talking now globally, population, N, and the per capita GDP, per capita impact. The totality, the product of that is, of course, global GDP. But we need a transformation for what we actually produce and how we rely on the biosphere. For that, we use an efficiency measure. Alpha, I'm going to call it the efficiency with which the biosphere's goods and services are converted into GDP. What people refer to as ecological footprint is then N times Y divided by alpha. That is to say, global GDP divided by the efficiency with which we are using material. Now, pretty much the whole of the economics of climate change has been concerned with alpha, mitigation. It has not looked at the numerator. Of course, that's the demand side. What's the supply side? What do I do to get the next one?
Is there another slide?
Yeah, for the next one, yeah. We haven't had an equation yet.
Wow.
I've just defined it. That's it. No, next one. That's it. So I want you to think of the biosphere as being a stock measured, say, in biomass, and generating services. Okay? All this can be made very precise, and there's a wealth of work done by ecologists to make that precise. I'll have to elide that. The demand if we're in a sustainable state, then the demand needs to be equated to the supply. If the demand exceeds, our impact is greater than what it can regenerate, we deplete the biosphere. And over the past 70 years or so, you have a strong inequality between demand and supply. The left-hand side, our impact, our footprint, exceeds the biosphere's capacity to regenerate itself. Hence, it is declining. Now, notice, as I said, I'll end now, the economics of climate change has concentrated on alpha, how to raise alpha so that the left-hand side declines in order to meet the gap between the left-hand side and the right-hand side. A sustainable world will be one where you have an equality between the demand and supply, of course. Okay? But the reason this obsession with alpha has been harmful is that it lends itself to the view that you can have continual growth in the numerator, namely GDP, while you increase your alpha. Now, I want to end by explaining why the metaphysical remarks I made can be made very concrete. There is no way alpha can go to infinity. If it could, it would be like saying that we can detach ourselves completely from the biosphere. We can produce goods and services without any effect, without any reference to the biosphere. So alpha is bounded above, which means that something has to give in the numerator. And a great deal of the review that that I'm preparing for the government. It's a global review, and it's an independent review, fortunately. I will be looking at, and I am looking at, both n and small y, and finding out, trying to determine ways by which the denominator can be reduced, even as we seek to increase the denominator. I mean, so the numerator can be reduced, even as we seek to increase the denominator. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Partha. I think the same flavour as trust is a phrase I'm going to come back to later, and it's a wonderful idea. Our second speaker is Emily Shuckburgh, who is a climate scientist, a mathematician, a science communicator, and a dab hand with an initialization, having been the leader of the Ocean Regulation of Climate by Heat and Carbon Sequestration and Transport, or Orchestra. It's lovely. She ran the Open Oceans Project in 2009 and the Polar Oceans team, and she is now the director, I mean, among other things, she is now the director of Cambridge Zero, which is the University of Cambridge Climate Change Initiative. I think she's also slideless.
I'm slideless.
Yeah, she's slideless, and I think probably just going to sit down and tell us stuff.
That was what I was thinking.
Excellent. Tell away.
So Oliver mentioned at the start that this is an important year both for climate and biodiversity with, well, hopefully later in the year, 2 large international conferences on each of those subjects. The climate one is going to, or hopefully going to be held in Glasgow, and that's COP26. It's COP26 because it's the 26th meeting of the conference of the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was brought together in 1992. Now, back in 1992, carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were 355 parts per million. Today, they are nudging up towards 415 parts per million. So all this time we've been discussing climate change on the international scale, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been steadily increasing. And the consequence of that is that temperatures globally are now around about 1.1 degrees Celsius warmer than they were in pre-industrial times. And we're starting to see the impacts of that climate change affecting our biodiversity, our natural world, and us as humans. So this last summer, we all saw in Cambridge record temperatures in the United Kingdom, 38.7 degrees Celsius recorded at the Botanic Gardens. And we've seen just in the last few months flooding in all sorts of different parts of this country, wildfires in Australia, really many, many different instances of extreme weather around the world where we've now been able to look at those instances of extreme weather and ask very carefully in scientific terms whether the risk of those extreme weather events has increased as a consequence of the climate change we've seen to date. And in many, many, many instances, we've been able to say that it has, and in some instances by factors of 5, 10, even larger increase in the risk of those occurring. It's not just the temperature that's increasing. There are many other measures that we can record a significant change. Sea levels are now about 25 centimetres higher than they were in pre-industrial times. And just today there was the latest study was announced looking at the melting of ice from the vast ice sheets covering Greenland and West Antarctica. Overwhelming evidence now that that melting is accelerating. It's contributing about 1/3 of sea level rise to date. Over the last, if you compare the last decade to the previous one, the melt from Greenland has increased 2-fold and from Antarctica 3-fold. So it's quite clear that we are accelerating into a climate crisis. At the current rate of warming, in the next 20 years or so, we're likely to exceed 1.5 degrees of warming. And why is that a concern? Well, it's a concern because as the temperature increases, the risks to all parts of the natural world and our society increase. So it is estimated that already there was a large report looking at biodiversity last year which estimated that in the coming decades some 1 million species are at risk of extinction. As temperatures increase, putting further stress on those species, then we're likely to see more and more species under threat. And it's particularly species, for example, in the polar regions, an area that I've studied significantly, that are particularly at threat. These are species whereas elsewhere in the world, as the climate changes, species can either move further poleward or further up mountains, but if you're already in the poles and it starts to warm up, you don't have anywhere else to go. It's estimated that between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius, some several hundred million additional people will be exposed both to the risks of poverty and of climate change. And it's those interconnections between the different risks that are so critical to understand and so critical to respond to. But probably one of the most concerning aspects is the risk of us exceeding at some tipping point, so risk of some catastrophic shocks occurring. And unfortunately, there are quite a number of areas of particular concern in that regard. So returning again to the polar regions, many of my former colleagues from the British Antarctic Survey are currently involved in a very large field expedition in Antarctica to look at the Thwaites Glacier. You might have heard some of it's been regularly covered over the last few months on, particularly on the Today programme and elsewhere in the media. And the concern there is that there's a couple of glaciers that are critical to the stability of the West Antarctic ice sheet, and there's quite significant evidence that those glaciers are now in potentially irreversible retreat. Not so much melting from above, but the warm ocean waters around Antarctica are encroaching underneath those glaciers and melting them from below. Now, why is that such a concern? Because the West Antarctic ice sheet contains within it meters of sea level rise. We don't know how long that would take to eventually contribute to that sea level rise, but when so many of our major and growing cities around the world are located in coastal regions, then even tens of centimetres of sea level rise can contribute to very significant global disruption. We're also concerned about methane. There are vast stores of frozen methane in the Arctic. And as the world warms up, could that methane be released into the atmosphere? And more studies looking at the Amazon rainforest, suffering not only through the effects of climate change, but also deforestation, which then itself has effects back onto climate change because of the vast sink of carbon that is stored in the trees of those rainforests. But the concern is that the Amazon rainforest could flip from being a rainforest into a savanna and have a global impact in terms of both an acceleration of climate change itself, but changing weather patterns around the world. So in the face of all of this, where is the world heading? Well, unfortunately, carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are continuing to increase. Our emissions are continuing to increase. Maybe the current crisis that we're immediately in might put a temporary halt on that. But nevertheless, we're heading in the opposite direction, more generally, to the direction in which we need to be heading in terms of global emissions if we're to address the climate crisis. Compared to today, we need to be halving emissions globally over the next decade and then reaching globally net zero emissions by around about the middle of the century. And there's no current sign that we're really on course for that scale of change, which is why what happens in the international negotiations later this year is so critically important. So that all sounds like a rather gloomy picture, and in the face of even more gloom going on in the world at the moment, perhaps it seems particularly challenging. Where there's perhaps some glimmers of hope is that in amongst all the potential climate tipping points, my sense is that there has started to be a tipping point in terms of public attitudes on some of this. It's been heartening to see over the last 12 months or so the rise of voices of young people, Greta Thunberg, the school strikes and so forth, and a significant change in general public attitudes, as well as attitudes in the business world in many instances. And the hope is that if that can also be reflected in terms of international policy, maybe we have a hope of turning this tanker around. We can come on perhaps in questions and answers in terms of some of the things that we're doing in Cambridge, but having spent the last 20 years or so working on the problem side of this, looking at as a climate scientist, I've been very excited over the last year to start looking at how we can try and address this from the solutions side of things, bringing together all the research capabilities across the university, but also, as importantly, looking to see how we can train up the next generation of leaders who will be helping us navigate through the coming decades. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Our third speaker is Martin Rees. When I was in my first term as an undergraduate in Cambridge, I remember two events taking place in a lecture hall in King's that had a deep effect on me. One was seeing the uncut version of Videodrome by David Cronenberg, and the other was seeing Martin talk about the lunacy of the Star Wars program. Martin has been talking about the way that science impacts the world, as well as doing world-breaking or world quality science for quite some time. He's been the Astronomer Royal. He's the 15th Astronomer Royal and has been since 1995. He's been Master of Trinity. He's been President of the Royal Society. If you know anything about quasars, then some of that's thanks to Martin, and if you know anything about the beginning and end of the universe, that's probably thanks to him too. But he does occasionally bring himself into a tighter focus, and he's written extensively about the problems of 21st century life, not in terms of sort of like dating or anything, but in terms of extinction and that sort of thing. But he is, for that, remarkably jolly and nice. And so I give you Martin and Rees.
Thank you, Oliver. Well, I'll start off with a cosmic perspective. The Earth's existed for 45 million centuries, and this is the first when one species, ours, can determine the biosphere's fate. We're deep in what people call the Anthropocene. We have an ever heavier collective footprint on the planet, partly because we're empowered by more powerful technologies and more demanding, but also because there are more of us. World population in the 1960s was about 3.5 billion. It's now 7.7 billion. And by the mid-century, 2050, it's expected to be about 9 billion, though it is leveling off after that time. Population growth seems rather under-discussed. That's partly because of associations with eugenics, Mrs. Gandhi's policies, and China's one-child policy, but also because doom-laden forecasts made 50 years ago by, for instance, the Club of Rome proved off the mark. There weren't any mass starvations. As it turned out, food production has kept pace with rising population. Famines still occur, but they're due to conflict or maldistribution, not overall scarcity. But to feed 9 billion people by mid-century will need further improved agriculture, low-till, water-conserving and GM crops, and some dietary innovations, converting insects, highly nutritious and rich in protein, into palatable food, and eating artificial meat and certainly not beef. To quote Mahatma Gandhi, there'll be enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. And the global challenge is to provide food and also energy and resources for this growing and more demanding population, and to do this in a sustainable way without encroaching irreversibly on nature. Because if humanity's collective impact pushes too hard, then the resulting ecological shock could cause mass extinctions, as Partha mentioned. We'd be destroying the book of life before we've read it. And biodiversity is a crucial component of human well-being. Partha's report will show us in detail, but it's clear we're harmed if fish stocks dwindle to extinction, and there are plants in the rainforest whose gene pool might be useful. And insects are crucial for the food chain and fertilization. But for many environmentalists, preserving the richness of our biosphere has value in its own right, over and above its benefit for us humans. And to quote the great Harvard ecologist E.O. Wilson, mass extinction is the sin that future generations will least forgive us for. Moreover, these pressures on biodiversity are aggravated by climate change. And this is, of course, a threatening issue which is not under-discussed, though it is still sadly under-acted upon. And as Emily said, under business-as-usual scenarios, we can't rule out later in this century really catastrophic warming and tipping points which might trigger long-term trends like the melting of Greenland's and the Antarctic's ice. Let's now turn to practical policies. The UK's Climate Change Act mandates a target of net zero. It's tough to meet this, even by 2050, which some people say is not soon enough, and to do this without a drastic speed up in the development and deployment of improved technologies. We need these for energy storage, smart grids, CCS, electrolysis to make liquid fuels, etc., and all these things. But even if we do all these things and meet our UK targets, we only make 1% difference to global CO2 emissions. We emit little more than 1% of the world's CO2. And what's far more crucial for global net zero is what happens in the developing countries of Asia and Africa. Unlike us, they can't reach what we consider acceptable living standards without generating more power than they do today. Not only must their per capita consumption rise, but they will harbour nearly 2 billion more people by 2050. It's the CO2 emissions from these countries that matters far more to the world, and indeed to us. We must hope that their growth will be far greener than Europe's has been, and that they will learn from our mistakes. And this suggests, to me, a more compelling incentive for accelerating our clean energy innovations in this country. It's this. We contribute, as I said, only 1% to global CO2 emissions. But we produce more than 10% of the world's high-impact scientific research. And if a scaled-up and wisely prioritised programme could give the UK a lead in some sectors relevant to more efficient and cheaper carbon-free energy generation, then we could help India and other vast developing markets to leapfrog directly to clean energy rather than building coal-fired power stations because they're cheaper. And our efforts could then make far more than 1% difference to the shift towards global zero carbon emissions. Likewise, incidentally, the UK's expertise in plant science could give us special leverage in helping all countries to feed themselves with intensive high-tech agriculture without encroaching still more on the natural world. Unconstrained climate change and irreversible loss of biodiversity is a threat to global security. Minimizing this threat deserves the scale of sustained effort which we commit to our national defence and the focus appropriate to a national emergency. But unlike defence R&D, we're here confronting a shared global threat, so we should forge cooperation and alliance with other nations. especially the developing countries for whom the threat's most severe and most intractable. And how best this should be done deserves wide discussion. I started these remarks with a cosmic perspective. I'll close with a more parochial one, addressed to those in universities like this one. It would be hard to think of a more inspiring challenge for young scientists and engineers than to deploy and develop UK expertise to provide clean energy and abundant food for ourselves and for the developing world. So that's, I think, an important thought which should encourage us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. I'm expecting that we will have a couple of questions for the panel from Bryony shortly. Indeed, this screen tells me that Bryony is typing. But before that, I wanted to ask all something that struck me listening to all your presentations in the context of Hugh's introduction and reminding us about the first of these lectures being in David's memory 4 years ago. What have you been able to tell the audience tonight that you did not know 4 years ago? Partha?
Even I didn't really nail down in a deep sense the fatuousness of thinking that we can have indefinite growth of GDP. It's a commonplace observation that it is possible. If you read The Economist, you get the sense every week that it's possible. My observation regarding our detachment from the biosphere, or whether we embedded in it, that's not a trivial distinction. It's to think that you can have, I go back to the left-hand side of the equation. I didn't bring it just to show you an equation. There was a meaning behind it. You want to unscramble, decompose our impact on the biosphere. And I did it with 3 parameters. You can do a lot more. You can unscramble it further, obviously. But these were a minimal set of parameters. And focus has always been on alpha, efficiency, not on the enumerator, thinking that you can increase alpha as much as you, with human ingenuity, will allow you to do that. In an embedded world, it is not possible because, as I said, if you shoot alpha to infinity, conceptually, of course, here, you're essentially saying you can have all the material stuff you need with no effect, no perturbation to the biosphere. So we're completely detached. That's not possible. So yes, I can argue against the economists, thinking that the idea that you can buy your way out through growth, as defined usually, is really misleading. It's extremely dangerous. I don't think I could have said it as convincingly 4 years ago.
Emily, 4 years ago?
So I think the biggest change, obviously our scientific understanding has increased over the time, but the biggest change is the one that I was mentioning at the end, the most recent change in public opinion. So I was looking at, the other day, I was looking at polling numbers for the UK in terms of the percentage of people who are very concerned about climate change. And there's been a really interesting evolution of that. So if we go back 15 years ago to the time when Al Gore put out his Inconvenient Truth movie, there was some 40% or so, I can't remember the exact number, but around about that, 40% in the UK in terms of the percentage of the population who were very concerned about climate change. There was actually quite a large amount of concern. And then various things happened, and there's concerted effort to discredit the science and etc. And that plummeted down to something 18% or something. That's now back up above the numbers that it was 15 years ago, over 50%. And that is so, that change, that regain in an understanding of what is at stake in the wider public, I think has been one of the most significant changes over the last less than 4 years, but compared to 4 years ago.
Martin?
Well, I learned a lot from David Mackay. I mean, I don't know how many people here knew him. He was a uniquely inspiring person. He was very ascetic. He actually lived the kind of life he wanted us all to live, and he had an amazing range of intellectual achievements, and his book is really a classic. But it did explain just how hard it was going to be to actually get all our energy from non-fossil fuels. And I think he made us focus on the difficulties of depending on wind and solar, and realizing that we need more energy from electricity if we're going to get transport and heating from not fossil fuels. So he made us realize how difficult it was, but he was an inspiring leader to make us think about it, and he got lots of people, myself included, who were really from other academic expertises to take it a bit more seriously. The other thing I want to say is to echo what Emily just said, because the degree of concern about climate, which was rather limited 10 years ago and 5 years ago, has of course percolated very widely. The young people's protests have been hugely effective and hugely welcome, but also the discussion about divestment and trying to get statements from major companies, even some major oil companies like BP, about what they're trying to do. This is something which wouldn't have been expected 5 years ago, and so we may be getting to one of these sort of tipping points in public opinion where it becomes conventional to take this issue seriously and try and do something about it, and that'll be good news.
Great. We also have some excellent questions from Bryony. Bryony Worthington, for those of you who don't know, Baroness Bryony Worthington, was the principal author of the UK Climate Change Act in 2008 and founded Sandbag, which has done a huge amount to publicise and raise awareness of emissions issues, and has generally laid the work in the UK for some of that change in public opinion we were just hearing about. But she asked some questions of all of you, but I think the first one I thought was very, very interesting, coming from what Martin was saying, which is a question for Emily. As your work, your new role, newish role in pulling together Cambridge's best minds on the climate challenge, are there any particular nature-based solutions that are exciting you and your colleagues? Something which you're thinking, oh yeah, this is going to make a difference? Nature-based being a key word here.
Yes, no, so I think that there's a lot of excitement and interest from many different quarters in nature-based solutions, and that's looking at ways in which we could try and have both a positive climate impact and a positive impact on biodiversity. To my mind, we're at a stage at the moment where we're, rather than being able to pick out one as being better than any others, we're at a stage of evaluating them. But there are many, it's much more than just planting more trees. And in fact, actually, even planting trees, it's much, one needs to understand what trees and where if you're to have both that positive impact on climate and biodiversity. One of the things that we were planning on having a workshop, I think it may be a virtual workshop in the next few weeks, was particularly looking at soils. Soils are much more than just mud, as it turns out, and are critically important as a store of carbon, and at the same time our soils are being degraded as never before. So that's an obvious area where we could, by treating our soils better, could have a positive climate impact as well as a positive impact more generally, including on biodiversity. But there are many other different aspects that one can look at as well.
And still, sorry, go on.
There is a related point that we overlook. That's not just restoration. Emily's absolutely right. The peatland, we live in Cambridge, just 10, 15 miles north. We've devastated absolutely some of the richest biodiverse ecosystems available, namely down under. But we forget that one person in my team has been given the task of estimating the totality of subsidies that the world governments offer for exploiting nature. And we are looking at double-digit trillions a year. That's horrendous. That is, we're looking at services which, as I began by saying, they're unseen, they're silent, so we miss them. And they're common property, so naturally we have a tendency to overuse them, even though they're valuable. But on top of that, we're subsidizing their use, which means we got a negative price for something which should be positive price. I think if we could, now they all have a rationale. You must remember, economists are really smart. We do, for farm subsidy, poor farmers. Water subsidy, what do you do? Thirsty. You need to, never mind fossil fuel, again for farming. But the idea would be to find more direct methods of helping those who are in need rather than subsidizing nature, or rather exploiting nature, giving a negative price to nature to do that. And so one of the things in the review we'll be doing is precisely to find ways by which you can ease the burden that we impose on nature. It's trashing our home.
That actually leads rather nicely into Bryony's question for you, Partha, which is that is there a policy that you think could be tested here in the UK and copied elsewhere that would properly value the natural world and thus properly disincentivize the trashing?
That's right, but the question then, what do you do with it? You see, to observe that, say, pollination yields something like 500 million pounds to agriculture, that number doesn't really have a policy implication. What you need to ask is, what would happen if there's a change in pollination, and so forth. So it is true, natural capital assessment is extremely important because it's part, we ought to move from GDP to something like a wealth. And one of the things that I did 20 years ago was to suggest that Adam Smith wasn't talking rubbish when he wrote The Wealth of Nations. He didn't talk about the GDP of nations. It was the wealth of nations. And wealth is assets. These are the things that we give to our children and pass on to grandchildren. We don't pass on services because they're fleeting. You can't pass on a service. It disappears the moment it's... But assets you do. And nature is an asset, a multifaceted asset, obviously. So yes, you do need to move to a system of accounts in order to get a sense of what constitutes economic success. Has to be in terms of an inclusive notion of wealth, which includes, of course, human capital, goes without saying, health, education, and so forth. But also all that stuff, all that furniture out there, which is doing so much for us, how are we passing it? Now, the data are pretty clear. Over the past 70 years or so, I keep on saying 70 years because 1950, Anthropocene and so forth, human capital has risen dramatically in quantity. Produced capital, of course, has, and that's what we usually notice. People live longer and so forth, and then produce capital as well. But natural capital systematically has been going down in value. Now, these are very crude estimates because most of these things don't have prices. Most of the stuff out there don't have prices, so you have to simulate the prices through, tease out. And there's a rich literature trying to do that. So it's all very, very crude. But the data are coming through loud and clear from the science as well as the economics that we have been trashing nature in a big way so that we have the inequality. That's what the inequality was suggesting. We need to somehow find ways to ease off the demand we make on the biosphere. And as I say, I don't see how we can do that without looking at future numbers and the standard of the material consumption that we engage in. These are tough choices, but...
I think Martin wants to come in, and then I have Bryony's question for Martin.
Yes, okay. Well, I mentioned in my earlier remarks that advanced biotech and GM, etc., is going to be important in intensive but sustainable agriculture to feed 9 billion people. But it might also help with dealing with climate change because there's, as you know, controversy about whether even 1 trillion trees is a good idea. to deal with climate change. But with better understanding, we might be able to cover ground more efficiently with plants that use up CO2, or even engineer kinds of trees that will grow in the tundra and places where natural trees don't grow, and where they can be planted in large numbers without encroaching on land use for other purposes. So I think we should be exciting about the potentiality of biotech, not just obviously for food, but also for dealing with CO2.
Okay, I'm just going to exercise chair's prerogative to say that big forests on tundra are a bad idea because they are warm compared to snow on the ground. I remember John Hart giving a wonderful lecture in Berkeley about this, saying they teach you that at the end of the Ice Age, the forests followed the retreating glaciers up to the pole. That's rubbish. They chased them up. But I'm going to ask you a different question.
If they're white, it's better.
Yes. There are reasons why trees aren't white, but that's another issue. Bryony's question for you was also along the high-techy sort of line, which was, at what point during the coming mass extinction does it seem right, as opposed to defeatist, to start just trying to store all the DNA you can so that something is in fact left and Ed Wilson's great-great-great-grandchildren don't have to hate us and him as much as they might?
Mm-hmm. Well, we know that there are seed banks, the Norwegian one and the one at Kew, and these are certainly very valuable. What you can do for animals, I'm not quite so sure, but that will come probably with cloning. If they're talking about sort of de-extincting mammoths and even dinosaurs, then they could do that with other more recently extinct species.
Do you worry that that talking about such things makes people think, oh, well, it's okay. Some friend of Martin's at University of California, San Diego is going to freeze these zygotes and...
I hope not, because I think also, even though these things can be done, there's a sort of yuck factor which makes us unhappy about them being done. And I would feel that about de-extinctions of mammoths and such like. Just like I think ideas about GM crops were sort of more negative simply because people didn't like the idea of GM modification to make rabbits glow in the dark and things of that kind, and thought that was sort of not befitting the dignity of animals, like putting clothes on monkeys in a circus or something like that. And so I think those early spectacular applications of GM turned people off because there was something distasteful about them. And I think that might be the case if one went too far in these de-extinction projects. But I think one thing they want to revive is the passenger pigeon, which was apparently the most common type of pigeon in the United States until about 1900, and then all became extinct. I'm not sure how exciting that is. I'd rather de-extinct the dodo than that, but these things can be done if one wants to.
I'm pro-dodo. And also pro-audience. I think it's time for you to, you've all been listening lovely, and I'm sure you all have thoughts. We have moving microphones, roving microphones, and as Hugh reminded you at the very beginning, please do not start your question before the microphone has reached you. I'm going to take questions about 3 at a time. I'm going to start with you, sir, up there. And then you, madam, over the aisle from there.
I think we've learned a lot over the last few years about the problems we face. It's not the elephant in the room, the matter of consumption, that we've got to get used to not having growth, to having shrink, and to accept that the level of economic activity in Western cultures has simply got to decline by a lot.
Woman over there, yes.
My question goes a bit in that direction, in the sense that I've heard politicians and scientists talk about how the UK only produces about 2% of the emissions of CO2, but it's certainly not what it consumes. Like the amount of consumption in the UK produces a lot more CO2 somewhere else in the world because we don't produce anything locally anymore. And that should probably be emphasized more, and we should know that percentage, which I don't know. Do you?
And the man in the West Ham colours on the aisle there.
I don't even know what those are. David McKay and also David King of this parish and many others have pointed out that with great difficulty we can probably do what we have to do for climate change with current technology. My concern is that talk about new technologies kind of lets politicians off the hook. They have to bring in difficult changes and more or less enforce things to make it work out now. If you say we're going to invent something tomorrow that's going to make it all very easy, they won't bother and we'll cruise on and have a catastrophe.
Okay, I'm going to apportion those. Partha, consumption is the elephant in the room.
That was a small y. That was the small y.
Yeah.
On the numerator. I mean, I was calling it per capita GDP, but.
But the question was, isn't the elephant in the room the question that people in rich countries should just be consuming less?
Yes, well, I was hoping that somebody would take the cue from what I'd written down, goes without saying. That's the whole point. But there's some good news. We economists have been really neglectful of anthropologists and sociologists, and we have a mental picture which is encouraged by us. I'm criticizing my colleagues. I'm not criticizing my subject. My subject is brilliant. Economics is a profound what we inherited from the past is just amazing stuff. But we misuse it, and we can misuse it very easily. We have encouraged through teaching graduate students textbooks, and then the graduate students, or then they go on to be journalists and so forth, of thinking of the human person as being an egoist. It's a sort of a supermarket view of life. We forget that we are social animals in the sense that we look to others to see what they're doing when we decide what to do. We're influenced by others. Sometimes it's competitive, like Veblen's conspicuous consumption. That was a competitive story. And that can lead to disaster because everybody's trying to beat up on the other. And we know how to think about it. Prisoner's Dilemma game is designed to look at it. But we also have a softer aspect to ourselves, which is conformist. We don't want to be too different from others. And there's a wealth of literature on this, but we economists don't use it. And the reason why this is probably good news is that the cost of reducing consumption, the elephant in the room, may be a lot less, cost in the sense of psychic cost, unhappiness, distress, a lot less than we think it is. If we are egoists, it would be a loss. You're just simply reducing your consumption, and you care about consumption. Your utility depends on your own consumption. But if your utility also depends on the average consumption of your neighbors or whoever else, then if collectively, if somehow are reduced, the stress on the individual would be far less. There's a good deal of data on that. So I wouldn't say that it's an elephant. It certainly is. But the very fact that we are influencing each other, that's another kind of externality. Population is taboo because it's such a private act. It's seen as a private. The problem is it has externalities when you have children. And in other words, they affect people, other people who are not party to the decision that you're engaged, that you're making. And the moment you think of externalities, you say, well, something has to give. You can't simply say, because you're otherwise saying that my right trumps everybody else's right. The whole point about externalities is that rights clash. And you need to negotiate that somehow or the other. And we do it. So although both population and consumption are elephants in the room, I think there is hope that if we think in social terms, the cost is likely to be less than we think.
I wanted to hybridize the other two questions and pass them to Martin and Emily, which is this question of whether we endeavour to feel good about ourselves by hiding either our consumption in the countries where the things that we buy are actually made, or by hiding our mitigation in the future where there'll be better technologies, and so basically it's everyone else except us. Do you find that a worrying aspect of the way that people congratulate themselves about the greenness of Britain?
A couple of points. I think in regard to the numbers, I think our actual emissions are about 1%, which goes up to 2% if you include manufactured goods in China that come here. So it's still a small fraction, very small compared to what's going to be produced by the developing world if they develop. And going back to the question over here, I think it is reasonable to persuade the public in general that driving around in SUVs and having patio heaters is naff rather than stylish. We can probably do things like that. But on the other hand, I do think that we'll have to make things easy if we want to achieve our targets. It may be okay for us, but if you're in India or somewhere like that, then you're not going to make any sacrifices. You're going to do the best you can, and we've got to make it easier for them to live a life like ours without using as much fossil fuels as we do. We can't expect them to make sacrifices when they see that we've made no sacrifices. So I do think that we're going to need a lot of new technology in order to make this acceptable not only to us but to the people who are desperate for a better life than they have now.
So I think the three questions do link very nicely together, don't they? Because, so in a sense, absolutely we need to reduce our consumption and growth accordingly. And technology can't be the only solution. We need to do the two together, so it's not an either or in that sense. In terms of our contribution in a global sense, yes, we do currently consume many products from abroad, and so we need to take that into account. But there's a sense in which one of the contributions, which Martin mentioned in his initial remarks, that we can really significantly make as a country is in terms of bringing our research and development expertise, in terms of trying to, on the one hand, help, as you were commenting, Martin, countries around the world leapfrog in terms of their own development. Mm-hmm. But actually, at the same time, that actually, when we look at our own consumption, taking into account that we are buying many products from abroad as well, then any reductions in emissions in those countries through technologies that we have helped to develop also then ends up feeding back in terms of reduction in our own footprint as well. So these things do connect together and end up having a much greater collective role. And so these things, you really do need to see these things in a connected system, and it absolutely isn't an either or in terms of technology or behavioural changes.
Okay, a couple more questions in the room, and I'm going to take one from the live stream as well. You, madam, and the gentleman from the spaceship Nostromo.
You seem to imply
that you'll need the mic, because otherwise the live streamers can't hear you.
You seem to imply that high-tech solutions are the main way forward. Do you think that we have things to learn from indigenous peoples in terms of how to preserve biodiversity?
Space Marine.
I'd like to ask you the same question I asked my MP, Caroline Lucas, down in Brighton. Would you support the Nobel Peace Prize for Greta Thunberg? She's been nominated twice. I see this as a symbolic generational acknowledgement to her generation's difficult and challenging future. So there's a way in which it's kind of a symbolic act to offset a genuine existential fear, which I think we've all seen way beyond that particular individual.
I didn't get that, did you? The question.
So we had those two questions, the individual act and the learning from indigenous people. And the question from the internet is, does anticipating solutions for climate change mean we have accepted a Promethean view of our planet? Which I think goes rather nicely, actually, with the question about high-tech and indigenous. And Promethean, obviously, in this context is a reference to the Titan who brought down the gift of fire to mortal humans and was rewarded by having his liver pecked out for all eternity. Perhaps more specifically here, it's the Cambridge historian Simon Schaffer talks about Promethean science as an experimental enterprise that mixes a vaulting ambition to safeguard humanity against a major threat with the troubling hazards of following this science's recipes. So it's the vaulting ambition and the troubling hazards. So, Martin,
Yes.
How Promethean are you?
Sorry?
How Promethean are you?
I think I am, because going back to indigenous people, I think that would work if the world's population was only 1 or 2% of what it now is. Really drastic cut in population. And maybe in the far future, when we certainly hope the population will go down from this 9 billion peak in 2050 rather than keep on going up, then we may end up with a world with a much lower population, and then one could go back to that sort of style. But just as we've needed at least some plant breeding in order to feed the present world population and double food production in the last 50 years, then I think we're going to need a lot of technology to keep people alive in even a basic way, given the population is so high. So I think for indigenous people, that they had a very low population density in people per square mile, as it were, and only in those contexts can you live that sort of life. Although we may hope that eventually people will get back to that.
I read your question differently from Martin. I think you're absolutely right. There is an enormous amount to be learned because they're there. I have done a good deal of reading of the material. One thing that makes the economics of biodiversity so difficult is that it's very spatially sensitive. Communities living in the Amazon face a completely different set of circumstances than communities living in, say, Nepal or in the semi-arid parts of India. And one of the great damages to the development process that took place in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s was an onslaught on the lives of the poor because the state knew what was needed. But the state didn't know what was needed. These were dirt poor people who lived on their local natural resource base, the lake for the fish, the pond rather, not lake. The lake would be rich, it's a pond. And the timber from the firewood, and the medicines from the forests. Now these are delicate issues. They couldn't write a treatise on it. But over the centuries, local knowledge when to husband the resource, when not to cut down a tree. That sort of knowledge is very specific to the region. Tons of work on fishing communities in Japan, in Belize, where they have extraordinarily sensitive norms of conduct. When to fish, where to fish, because they have a sense of the migration pattern and the movements of the fish. Now, the chap in central authorities haven't a clue about this. I mean, they could be great ecologists for sure, but the great ecologist becomes great because he or she has actually gone there in the cold face that's trying to understand the ecology of the system. So the answer is yes, absolutely. They're desperately needed. And the assumption that we know the local ecosystems is just completely false. It's not top-down nor bottom-up. You need a balance between the information that local communities have, the resources that are available to the top, because you do need government help. But for the government to pretend, or the experts to pretend, that because they're illiterate, they do not know their local ecosystem, is just about the worst mistake you can make.
Could you just repeat the question you asked Caroline Lucas?
It was Greta. Should Greta get a Nobel Prize?
Right, okay.
Shall I comment on that?
Yes, well, yeah, that's the question, yeah?
Yeah, it was just, would you support her to get the Nobel Prize, which she's been nominated for twice, as an act from one generation to another, a symbolic act to an existential fear for her generation's challenging future? So that's the gist of it.
And extra challenge from the chair. Please answer this question without mentioning Henry Kissinger.
No, but I mean, she's been incredible, hasn't she? And actually, I think one of the things, both climate change and biodiversity loss, they can seem these such vast global challenges that how possibly can, I as an individual make a difference on these global problems? It seems as though they're just too vast. Or even how can we as a country, when we're only 1 or 2% of global emissions, possibly make an impact on such a vast global problem? And in a way, I think one of the most inspiring things about Greta is that she is the embodiment of how actually one single voice can start to change the world. And so actually all of us could, should we choose to, have global influence. And for that reason, if nothing else, I think she has had an incredible influence.
I mean, I think I agree with that. And of course, the Nobel Peace Prize went to an 18-year-old Pakistani girl already, so it would not be too much out of line to do that. And again, in the light of what Emily just said, there's a wonderful saying from Margaret Mead, the great anthropologist, that it takes only a few determined people to change the world. Indeed, nothing else ever has.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm going to ask a chair's question here to all of you, but for very quick answers, which is we're currently in the early stages of a new, different, quicker global problem. What do you think people are going to learn about the sort of commitment needed for the long-term problems of climate change and biodiversity from the short-term changes we'll be facing during the pandemic?
So, I mean, it's obviously a concerning time in terms of the international health for all of us. But I think there may be opportunities for very positive outcomes from some of this. And in a way, that's a reflection of the fact that we live in a highly interconnected system. So just one, it feels to me as though some of the things that we will be forced to do over the coming weeks and months, and indeed already starting to do, potentially could lead to tipping points in behavioural change that have benefits, particularly among, in some of the climate change biodiversity aspects as well. And one of the things that we've already mentioned a number of times is moving to, suddenly we're all embracing virtual conferences or doing more things online and so forth. We were talking earlier about school lessons suddenly maybe being delivered online. But clearly, one of the things that is a major challenge in terms of all our lifestyles, it's a behavioural change and a technology issue, flying around the world and the environmental costs of that. Well, actually, if we can tip to doing more things in a virtual way and less getting on a plane and flying halfway across the world, then maybe that will be a positive thing to come out of the challenges of the coming months.
Martin or Partha, anything that you think the pandemic will teach us about global problems?
Well, I think the point is that the trouble with getting people to take climate change seriously is that there's nothing sudden and immediate. It's a global, gradual change, and people therefore don't react the same way. But I certainly think that people may realise after the next few months that in fact it is better to stay at home more, not have so much frantic travel, and that will have have an effect. But there again, this goes back to what I said earlier, that people won't change their behaviour if they feel it's a great hardship. But I think they realise that perhaps it's not a hardship, it's actually a better life, not to keep going through airports and all the rest of it. And if that's something which is imprinted on people in the next few months, that will have a lasting benefit.
Okay, I'm going to go back for questions around the room. You, sir, quick, and then you, madam, up there.
What's the place of A, nuclear energy, and B, climate engineering in the solution? Thank you.
Okay. Question up there. Yes.
Thank you. I'm wondering how you see the future of farming in view of both climate, food production, and biodiversity. I'm thinking particularly in this country, also more generally, because you don't simply have to look at, indigenous communities in the Amazon or somewhere to find people who have an awareness of being embedded in the whole of nature. This is also a feature of farming communities throughout the world. Some people are suggesting that that whole way of life effectively needs to go for more streamlined forms of food production.
And gentleman up there.
The big decisions in the world these days are driven by money. It seems to be, and money these days is created by just generating debt out of nowhere. That power seems to be in the hands of sociopathic bankers, enviropathic people, and just today 500 billion was given to Wall Street bankers. That is a lot of power that could be better directed rather than malinvested. Is the current financial system a help or a hindrance? Does it offer potential or a barrier?
Hi, can someone in audiovisual work out where that noise is coming from?
Yes, I worked it out and I solved it. It's a technological fix which actually worked. I have my doubts about some of the others.
Excellent. Sorry, you were saying, so what's the actual question?
I'm just wondering whether the fact that everything these days seems to be driven by wealth or money that can be created out of nothing, and that power is in not necessarily the right hands, whether a different kind of system based on sound money is needed, or whether we can use that, get those decisions into the right hands and direct that money in a particular direction.
I think I get that. So, nuclear energy, climate engineering, farming, and the global financial system. I'm open to offers. Martin.
Well, on nuclear, of course, there's a controversy, and many people are anti-nuclear on principle. My view is that we should promote R&D into fourth-generation nuclear technology, because remember that the existing power stations are based on 1960s designs, and we can do better now. And I particularly think that we ought to encourage R&D into the small modular reactor. And indeed, in the UK, we had huge expertise in nuclear. Now the only real expertise is in what Rolls-Royce does to build nuclear engines for submarines, and that can be used to make a small modular reactor of a kind that can be made in a factory, put on the back of a lorry, and taken away to some site, and they're probably 100 megawatts each. And so if this technology works, I think it might be more acceptable than existing nuclear technologies. The only other thing I wanted to say was about farming. I think I said that we had to eat less beef and all that in future, but one plus would be to get rid of the cruelties of factory farming, because the only way you can produce large amount of food, animal food, is through this sort of factory farming, which I think will be seen as one of the real evils of this era.
Partha.
The response to the farming, the deep question you've asked, it's very hard to predict, but obviously one of the transformations that can easily take place, we don't know exactly how it will be, would be if the subsidies are removed. You were talking about European farming. So they have been a terrible decision. We waste 50% or so of food. That suggests the food is too cheap. When I say we, I meant the privileged us. I don't mean people elsewhere. So food is too cheap, and it's cheap because it's been subsidized like crazy. So I see real transformation there. But can I come back to a point that Morton raised, which I think is very important? He was saying that we would, in some sense, I was reading his response about the fact that our lifestyle is changing for, at least for the foreseeable future, like a few months. All our meetings have been canceled. We're earthbound now in a big way. And we don't see it as a bad thing, say, because I don't feel too bad not going to a meeting because I know Martin's not going either. And remember, I began by talking about social embeddedness. I would be extremely annoyed if Morton goes on traveling and for some reason I'm not allowed to. And I suspect he would too. But both of us are confined. So this collective, these coordinating mechanism like a epidemic has its virtues, which is of course what you both were suggesting. And then maybe we get used to it, hopefully, because that too was very cheap. International travel was far too cheap relative to the externalities it's generating, which is of course where you come from.
What about our friend's question about cheap debt and also about the ways in which better system, are there ways to make the making of money work better for the environment and less well for the existing financial system?
I suppose the figure's on me because
it is kind of, yeah.
Here. I'm not an expert. Look, serious problems arise out of the fact that we've got a price system which is all over the place. Prices aren't signaling scarcities. That's how I began. Mm-hmm. Nature is, much of nature is free. So why would an entrepreneur invent new technology which economizes on nature? You'd be crazy. You try and economize on the more expensive inputs, labor-saving devices. You don't say nature-saving device, well, that's free on offer. So much of it's easy to criticize investment firms, but the signals they have, the incentives they have are wrong. And they're wrong because we have chosen to make them wrong. We means the citizen. At the end of the day, those of us who are privileged to live in democracies, changes will occur only when citizens, the concerned citizen acts. And that was what Emily was talking about earlier, about the young lady who was, it has to happen that way. But when we protest, it is important to have the support of sophisticated arguments. The phenomenon of the young lady is one of a neglected issue. She's not there to say what should be done. She's saying we ought to be thinking about this. And otherwise, my generation and my next and our children's generation are being sacrificed. And that's exactly right. That's the right way to proceed. But we then need also to identify what it is that's causing this imbalance, this huge imbalance, this inequality that I started with. And there, it's clear nature is too cheap. We've decided to make it cheap. And it has to be either through quantity controls, regulations, or price system. That I don't know. These are details that need to be worked out case by case. But as of now, the price signals are all wrong, really wrong. And they're all against nature. That's the bias is there.
2 more questions. We have very little time, so make your questions sharp and amenable to sharp answers. And Yes.
Yes, my question is about what Laura Reed talked about, transferring of technology to other countries. That sort of, they need to have an education that is enable the people in those countries to understand the technology. Plus, the countries developing the technology will have a price for that technology to be transferred to other countries. So that we'll see a conflict between...
So what's the question?
The question is learning, transfer of technology to countries that are not able to learn it. And the price it costs for those countries to have to pay for the technology.
Yes. Sorry. Thank you. Well, one of the issues that constantly comes, it seems that we are in the bubble, inside the bubble, inside the bubble. We are in Cambridge, in academia, in the hub of genomics, technology, science, and that creates a bias sometimes, and we lose perspective of what is in other cultures, other solutions, other perspectives, like the indigenous. And in that bias, we hear often this idea that might be right or wrong, but we hear it often that technology will solve all our problems. While one of the problems that is behind the problems, like the problem of CO2, which is a symptom, the cause behind that have been mentioned very often.
Yes, could you possibly bring, we do only have about 2 minutes left.
Yes.
And it would be nice to hear.
So,
question.
The desacralization of nature, and making nature something that we can solve with technology and transform into benefit. Is there any solution, any movement among the scientist community that is addressing the spiritual aspect of the relationship with nature and the ecosystem and ecodiversity?
Okay, 3 questions, because I'm taking one from Bryony as well. Tech transfer, a spiritual awakening in the science of nature, and from Bryony, and I'm actually mangling her question, 2050, will there be more wilderness on the Earth or less? Take your pick, but you're going to answer Bryony's anyway, but you take your pick from the other 2.
Yes. Well, I mean, I share your hope about this attitude to nature, but I genuinely don't think we'll get climate change reduced in a way acceptable to the public without more new technology. I think we do need technology, but I do think, in answer to the other question, that we've not got to do it in a neo-colonialist way. We've got to, as I said, collaborate with the experts in those countries. There are plenty in India with whom one can collaborate, and so I think this should be a collaborative project, but I'm saying that we can do more if we try and help countries in Africa and Asia to develop technology in collaboration. And universities can play an important role here.
Yes.
Shall I do some more wilderness? Or in some ways, you might think that if either we tackle the climate and biodiversity challenge, in which case you might hope there'd be more wilderness, or we don't, in which case there might be more wilderness. And so one way or another, either way.
Vote for wilderness.
And the question really is what that wilderness consists of. Mm-hmm. So that, is it the rich, biodiverse wilderness that one might hope, or is it, were you overtaken by?
It could be a dead zone.
It could be a dead zone, right? Yeah. But it's still wilderness.
That's right.
It needn't be if we have sustainable, intensified agriculture.
And
we don't need to use more land to feed everyone.
And the question about spirituality, is there a spiritual dimension to the work that the Cambridge group does?
Oh, but I mean, I think that one of the things that is very, very clear is that on none of these is there some magic techno fix, and that actually not only it's behavioural change, but that more deeper sense of bringing in the more spiritual dimensions is so critical to all of this. Yeah. And absolutely, this isn't just about the scientists and engineers. This is about learning from from the indigenous populations that we've been discussing, indigenous knowledge, from what we can learn from history, there's so many different, this is a multi-dimensional problem that requires multi-dimensional solutions.
Part of the last 60 to 80
I think the last chapter of the review is going to be about a discussion with the Education Ministry. I think there needs to be education reform. I think children ought to be, in addition to the 3 R's, which are extremely important, obviously we ought to have nature studies from the first year onwards. There is a deep case for trying to understand, and I think that should be run right through to undergraduate courses. It is just too important a subject to be left to ecologists, if you like. It's something that all of us...
Martin, if you're going to say something in one sentence about wilderness?
Yes, I'm going to say that we've got to appreciate the wilderness, and I think our secular Pope, David Attenborough, has done more to make the world care about these things.
That's right.
And the real Pope also had a big impact through his encyclical in 2015. He has a billion followers in Latin America, East Asia, and Africa. And whatever you think of the Catholic Church, you can't deny its global range, its care about the world's poor. And he had a big effect in leading to the consensus in Paris. So the Pope and the secular Pope had a big effect.
Well, then, and also a great idea for film fans that we now get a sequel to The Two Popes with the other 2 popes, in which Jonathan Pryce and David Attenborough talk at each other, and we will all listen to it, and it's lovely. Thank you all for talking to us. Thank you for listening, and thank you for your questions. A fascinating evening's discussion, and I look forward to seeing you all next year. Thanks very much.